Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to the podcast. And welcome back to another of the AMA episodes, Ask Me Anything. As always, I am joined by my partner in crime, the incredible sleep and, in fact, even dreaming mind of Dr. Etty Ben Simone. Etty, hello, welcome back.
Hello. It's great to be here with you, Matt.
Okay, dive straight in. Let's see what questions that we have.
So, our first question today is from a listener that said that they watched your interview on the Skinny Confidential podcast, and they are asking, are you trying to be Axl Rose in Guns N' Roses cover band? They do say they're just having fun, but I think the listeners would like to know your answer, Matt.
Oh, good. Yeah, I've been kind of saying that. Firstly, no one apparently told me that the pandemic was over and that I could get my hair cut. Please don't go online and watch this. But anyway, yeah, my hair is a little longer than it has been historically in the past. But yes, they caught me. That is absolutely true. They are correct in the fact that I will probably be buying next up a bandana, some leather pants, and then I'll convince my friends to start calling me Sleepin' Roses. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to stick to sleep for now. But if the listener hears of perhaps a karaoke night in the Bay Area that is righteously good, please let me know. And I may just try my first debut rendition of, I don't know, let's do a Twitter poll and then we'll put out like 5 Guns N' Roses songs and they will vote and I'll have to sing it. If
That's
I
a
ever
sold out
do
event.
that.
I'm telling you.
People losing the will to live in the crowd.
And if you
Okay,
get leather pants, they have to be fake leather because it's Berkeley, remember?
exactly. Yeah, it's so de rigueur for Northern California. But yes, clearly I'm transitioning into Axl Rose.
I really like your long hair. I think it's
Uh,
beautiful.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you to say. That's the most diplomatic thing anyone's ever said about it so far. So
Well,
anyway, can
I
we
always like long hair in men. It's a thing.
when people look at it, if there is any poster child picture that screams midlife crisis more than mine, please send
I,
it
I
to me.
think I think a red Porsche is still way up there.
Yeah, it's going to be one that you buy for a kid. That's the best I can afford probably so far. Okay. Anyway, can we crash on to do we have
Yes.
any questions about the real science of sleep?
So now my question about sleep. It actually is somewhat related. People are asking, does beauty sleep actually exist, or are we all just dreaming?
Uh, well, we can't get off the aesthetic theme today,
Yes,
can we?
exactly.
Actually, it turns out that the science does support the idea of beauty sleep and good quality of sleep being essential for at least giving yourself the best chance for your most youthful, I think, and as you will see, perhaps attractive appearance. There was a fantastic study by a wonderful friend and colleague, Dr. Tina Sunderland, and I've spoken about it before on this podcast. And she did this epic study, and essentially it was a 2-part study to prove scientifically that there is a thing called beauty sleep. So she, in part number 1, she took a group of individuals and she gave them a full night of sleep. And then she gave them a night of no sleep, or at least reduced sleep, I should say. And then the next day, after sleep and minimal sleep, those individuals had a portrait picture taken under identical lighting conditions at the same distance with the same equipment. So at this stage, you've got a group of individuals. Everyone has gone through 2 experimental arms of the study, sleep and reduced sleep. And everyone essentially has a headshot, like you're shopping around LA as an actor. Anyway, they had 2 headshots, one under conditions of being sleep rested, the other when they were sleep deprived. Now came part 2 of the experiment. Here, the new collection of participants were essentially the independent judges in a beauty competition. And those independent judges, they knew nothing about the context of the experiment. All they were simply told is that you're going to see lots of these headshots of different individuals, and you may see the same individual twice. And all they had to do was rate how tired those individuals looked, how sickly those individuals looked versus how healthy they looked. And drumroll, finally, how attractive or unattractive those individuals looked. And what they found was that even though the judges had no knowledge of the two experimental conditions, they consistently rated the individuals when they had had a full night of sleep as looking less tired, more vibrant, more alert, more healthy rather than more sickly. And then finally, they rated them as being significantly more attractive when they'd had a full night of sleep. And when they were sleep deprived, they rated them as being significantly less attractive. Again, they knew nothing about whether they had slept, had no sleep. They didn't have any context of the study. They were an independent panel of assessors. I think that to me was one of the best studies, the demonstration that there really is such a thing called beauty sleep. You could then ask the question, well, then what is it about sleep that influences your appearance? Here, I think it's probably mostly about skin health
Mm.
and the coloration and the presentation of the skin. During sleep, we know that the body, but also the skin, which, by the way, we forget, is the largest organ of our body. It undergoes repair from all of the daily environmental damage, things like UV exposure, pollution, all of that good stuff. And collagen, which is essential for skin elasticity and firmness, that is increased in its production during sleep. And so you can imagine that if you're not getting that sufficient sleep, you're not getting your daily, I don't know, daily facial. Does a facial help with skin damage? I don't know. Anyway, you get the idea. It's basically a spa for the face. And
Yeah,
the
it replaces buttocks. Is that what it's
um,
called? Buttocks.
Botox.
Botox, sorry.
Botox. Yeah, I think buttocks is a slightly different
Slightly
thing.
different.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. And
Aesthetic-wise, it's
yes,
still in the same arena.
it is. Oh, sometimes the pronunciations catch you every time, don't they? And all of a sudden, we're straight back to Axl Rose, leather pants, and who knows what.
We can't get
Um,
away with it today.
no, we really can't. I suspect that about 3 minutes of this recording is going to be arable out there because we're going to have to cut most of it. It's not PG friendly. Anyway, what else? I would probably say the other thing is sleep affects hydration levels, that skin can start to become dehydrated throughout the day and it gets this sort of dull appearance. And sleep can help with that as long as you try not to have too many of those. I think it's really the cotton pillows that can actually draw moisture out of the skin during sleep rather than sleep's
Mm.
job, which is trying to hydrate it. And I think that's why people use more silk pillows because they're better at maintaining or capturing the hydration in the skin. Apparently, the silk pillows, and I must do a podcast on this, they do help with the wrinkles on the face. I mean, I'm clearly in my midlife crisis. I should be more concerned about what type of pillowcase I'm using, but I don't pay attention to too much of this sleep wrinkle phenomenon. But it is a real thing. And I think these pillowcases can certainly help with the skin appearance. But anyway, I'm drifting, all of which is to say that sleep is a reparation for the skin. And without sleep, you start to get these, it's almost like a sickly pallor, sickly look to the skin. And you get those dark bags around the
Mhm.
eyes. That darkness is caused by the broken blood vessels, tiny micro damage to the blood vessels that is caused by not being able to sleep. And I think, in truth, with all of this kind of skin hydration stuff that's going on during sleep, I was reading that Estee Lauder, the lady herself behind the brand, she clued into this back in the 1980s. Everyone was doing skincare products for women to capture the day. And what she realized is that the industry was failing to also capture the night.
Mm.
And I think her approach was the day was for skin protection, whereas the night was for skin reparation, for repair. And she created these nighttime skin care line, a sort of a serum, I think. And that serum is still being sold today, those decades later. And I was looking at some of the reviews. I wish I could get those kind of reviews for my podcast because they're pretty sensational. People seem to love the stuff. So all of which is to say to the readers or listeners' question, is there such a thing as beauty sleep? Yes, there is. Without sleep, you look less attractive. And with sleep, there are a number of cascade processes that are designed to try to rejuvenate your look and rejuvenate your skin. And maybe it is a form of nocturnal Botox. Any thoughts on that?
Two thoughts I have. One of them is accidentally once we asked people after a night of no sleep, so just one night, if they feel attractive. We wanted to actually ask them if they feel how active they feel, but we had a bit of a spelling error there. And that resulted in actually the first time that we saw that people themselves feel as attractive when they haven't slept. So it's not just how other people judge you. It's your feeling as well that it changes without sleep.
And I think that's a really important point too, from a serious perspective. Many of us will obviously feel good about others describing something nice and kind about our appearance. And again, on this show, I'm not trying to suggest that vanity is the ultimate metric, but I think everyone has some degree of vanity, even if we admit it to ourselves in the dark of night or publicly out there. Clearly, if I'm trying to be Axl Rose, I have that kind of a problem too. But I think that the notion that not only other people are commenting on your appearance, but that you yourself
Yeah.
feel good about how you look is not a trivial thing. I was speaking with a friend and a colleague who is a plastic surgeon, and they do corrective surgery, but they also just do plastic surgery for aesthetics. And a couple of years ago, I didn't probably have the greatest view of plastic surgery, because I was inculcated British typical in this, oh, is that a little bit of a play on vanity? But I really started to read a lot more about it and started to speak to a number of folks that he referred me to as well. And when you listen to the stories, even if it's not only for a significant corrective surgery, for example, like a cleft lip, and they will alter that, but even just for the sake of people wanting to change their appearance, the mental health benefit for those individuals was really quite striking. And you think about how hard it is to change aspects of things like depression. We have had a history of medications like antidepressants that have had very mixed success in helping people out. We're still trying to come up with novel techniques to do this. But here was something for a very specific function, which was the alteration of appearance that transformed people to feeling very insecure and very hermit like in their pro-social interactions, to
Mm.
finally feeling confident in themselves and re-engaging with society in a way that they really wanted to celebrate being out there in the world. It completely reoriented my mental furniture on the iOS deck of what had been, I think, a really odd bias and a very stigmatized view from myself. And I got schooled in the
Mhm.
transformation of that thinking. I think it's an amazing profession. I really do. And I applaud them.
Yeah, and we know how much social connection is so critical for good mental health.
We are a pro social species. And if you look at for example, and you do a lot of work on this, and you'll probably be able to quote the stats more than I can, but the consequences of loneliness are not too dissimilar to the mortality and morbidity risk that is smoking.
Yeah, and obesity.
All of which is to say, I think for people who embrace that aspect, if that's the flag you were raising, I will salute it 5 ways till Tuesday. And if it's not your thing, I absolutely understand where you're coming from as well. We are democratically pluripotent in our beliefs across numerous.
Especially aesthetically.
Yes, exactly. Clearly, from question number one.
Another thing, just I wanted to mention about beauty sleep. Not many people think about this, but another way sleep helps us is by how expressive our face becomes. So there are a few studies showing that we don't show our emotions as much using facial expressions if we didn't get enough sleep. So maybe it's just our face even becomes lazy by grouching or smiling. The muscles themselves don't work as efficiently without sleep. So that can also contribute to how other people perceive us, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it probably comes on to some of the work that you've described, where When someone interacts with a sleep deprived individual, firstly, you don't feel as though you want to socially connect with them as strongly as you would do had they been well rested. And furthermore, you yourself walk away feeling more lonely and sort of socially isolated, having interacted with that individual who themselves seems sort of socially isolated and a social recluse. They've become what we call asocial, the absence of wanting to be social. So then you can ask, well, why? Why is it when you interact with someone like that, you don't feel as though you want to continue a social interaction with them? Why do you walk away feeling more lonely? I'm quite sure that part of it is the visual appearance of that individual. They're not emoting, they're not expressing, and that bidirectionality of nonverbal emotional cues is part of the social glue that binds us together in this kind of dyad of beautiful social interaction. And when that's missing, all of a sudden, you don't feel as though you want to sort of cleave to that person and move towards them socially. I also think, and what I'd love to hear your thoughts, Etty, too. I spoke about nonverbal, but there is the verbal component too, and the tone of the voice in terms of sleep and sleep loss. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, in studies, we see that people's voices become more monotonous. So there's less variations in the pitch of the voice. So talking to someone who is sleep deprived might also sound a bit more boring. You would think that they're less interested in what you're telling them. So we're seeing these changes. And I remember Matt us talking about whether we could one day detect sleepiness through voice by having someone call in, having some algorithms detect
Yeah.
excessive sleepiness in someone's voice. I think it's doable sometime in the future, especially now that we have such sophisticated algorithms we can use.
Yeah. So I ended up developing some ideas around it and took out a patent for it, not for making any money or, in fact, if anything, to try to risk mitigate folks doing that and trying to make money. I'd like it to be an open source tool that people can use. But my idea was thinking, could you create essentially a breathalyzer for sleep loss or maybe your own accumulating sleep debt that is not a breathalyzer, but is using vocal tone to
Mm.
assess your extent of sleep debt. And therefore, would you need fancy sleep trackers and technology? I think they're great. I think they would do it very accurately too, and many of them are doing it. But for those who don't have that opportunity, most people do have a smartphone. And all you'd need to do is just speak a couple of lines into the phone that it randomly generates. It assesses you relative to your baseline when you've been telling it, I've been getting really good sleep. And it has a computational capacity to understand how sleep deprived are you today, and maybe even how much accumulated debt are you carrying right
Mm.
now in terms of your absent sleep relative to your innate sleep need. So, yet another one of those things that I'll do when I retire or stop writing all of the grants and doing the science that we love to do. So for, oh gosh, it must be at least a decade now, I have been an avid, probably more like rabid consumer of protein shakes. But the hard thing, honestly, in the supplement space, if you really understand and do your diligence, is this critical thing called trust. It is very hard to find a brand that you can truly trust. That's when I came across the company Puri and the really impressive founder. Even though I'm sure it makes them less profit versus other quick and loose companies, Puri takes quality more seriously than any company I've ever seen before. They have so many offerings, gosh, protein powders galore, but lots of other additions. But that's what I was focusing on here. Why did I choose them? Well, it's really for four specific reasons. Number one, they are free from hormones. Number two, they are free from GMOs. Number three, they are free of any pesticides. And number four, and this is the critical confidence part, every single batch is third-party tested for over 200 harmful contaminants, things like heavy metals, etc. All you have to do if you are a neurotic nerd like me, you can even scan the QRI code on the back of the product to get the third-party independent laboratory test results. That's how much trust and confidence they place in their product. By the way, if you want a recommendation, go for the dark chocolate flavored protein powder. It's just exceptional. In fact, it's wonderfully addictive. I didn't just say that. Anyway, it delivers 21 grams of protein per serving. And for folks of my podcast right now, you can save 20%. So go over to peori.com/Matt Walker, and that is spelled PUORI.com, Matt Walker. So again, that is PUORI.com/Matt Walker, and you will get 20% off your product. Okay, next question.
These are great ideas. I can't wait for the future. All right, second question. Oh my. Can napping really make you smarter, or is it just an excuse to snooze at work?
Oh, it's completely an excuse. Of course it is.
It's the best excuse.
Yeah.
It's scientifically proven.
Yeah. If you ever you notice that you're fired because you were sleeping on the job, bring me in. I'll testify in some kind of negotiation.
The right to sleep team will be there for you.
Yeah. Reclaim your right to a full day of sleep, not just a full night of sleep. It turns out that, I suppose depending on how you want to measure smarter, I think that's probably a slightly hard metric, but in essence, it can make you smarter in at least two ways. We did a study, and it was led by the wonderful Dr. Bryce Mander, who's now a professor down at UC Irvine. And when he was working with me at the Sleep Center, we did a study where we looked at how a nap can restore the brain's capacity to learn. So we had a group of participants, and around midday, they all learned a whole list of new information. And then after that, we tested them to see how effective that learning had been. Then the participants were randomly assigned to one of two experimental groups, a nap group and a no nap group. The nap group took, or at least had, about a 90-minute sleep opportunity. Now, they didn't sleep for all of it, but they had the chance to sleep, and all of them did sleep. And then the other half of the participants, they were in the no nap group. All they simply did was essentially lie on a bed and just watch a nature video for the 90-minute duration that the other participants had the chance to sleep. And then when we woke them up, we allowed them about an hour to sort of wake up in the nap group and gave them more time in the no nap group. And then we had them try to learn a whole new list of facts. And then we tested them again. So we were able to assess the learning capacity of their brains at two different time points, before and after each one of these two experimental conditions. And what we found is that the group that remained awake across the day and did not nap, their learning capacity deteriorated across the day. Whereas those in the nap group, they were able to maintain, if anything, directionally, they were able to improve their learning capacity after the nap. And the difference between those two groups at that second learning session later that afternoon was almost 20%. And you think, well, 20%, I've had numbers of lots of cognitive science facts of 60 and 50%. Well, if you're a student and you got your exam score, and then someone like me comes along and says, by the way, would you like an extra 20% to your grade? Everyone would dive at that chance. It's not a small benefit. So that's the first way I would say, which is we found that naps can refresh and restore your learning capacity for basic textbook fact-like memory. Then there's great work. We've done some of these studies, but great work by pioneers, people like Sarah Mednick and colleagues who really just exploded this field of napping, where they said, okay, not does your nap seem to restore the capacity for new learning. They asked, after you've learned information, when you take a nap, do you cement and improve that memory during sleep so that when you wake up, you are better able to recall that information? And that's exactly what they found. Again, using sort of short naps I think they were down to as little as about 30 or 40 minutes. And that was able to restore and enhance certain aspects of learning and memory that they had imprinted before the nap. So, in other words, a nap will restore your ability to initially form memories, and a nap will also take those new memories and it will cement them into the architecture of the brain.
Matt, I'm
Yeah.
not clear on the difference. In the first study, they also had to memorize pairs of words, right?
Yes, but in the first study, we had them learn a list of facts before the nap or the no nap condition, and then we tested them right afterwards to assess how well did they learn that list number A. And then after the nap and then after the no nap, we actually didn't test them on the A list. Instead,
Mm,
they just simply woke up, and about an hour later, we had them learn a completely new list,
I
list
see.
B. And in that way, all we're doing is simply measuring the brain's ability to imprint information, to learn or encode those memories. Whereas the studies by Sarah Mednick and colleagues, they were asking the question, when you learn during the day, does a nap after learning take list A, as it were, and then improve and boost it so that when they do finally test them, not right afterwards, but a delayed memory test after the nap on list A, then all of
I
a sudden
see.
you get this wonderful boost. So sleep before learning to imprint memories, and then sleep after learning to hit the save button on those new memories.
I see.
I should also note that there's been some great work. I think it's a lot of it out of Jan Bourne's group. And there's been a review on this too, where you can kind of ask, what is the dose response relationship with naps? In other words, how short or long do those naps have to be? And what we found is that after about 10 minutes or so of a nap, you get basic alertness restoration. You can concentrate, you feel a little bit more energized, and your ability to focus on things is improved. But once you get past about 30 or 40 minutes, now all of a sudden these more complex brain processes of learning, memory, emotional regulation, decision making, problem solving, that's when all of those things start to get a boost, not after just 10 minutes, but you have to sleep a little bit longer. So I would say, and I did a podcast on this kind of like the art of napping, if you really want a protocol, and my friend Andrew Huberman always said, Matt, you've got to speak about protocols. So, in terms of a protocol, I would say limit yourself to about a 20-minute nap. If really what you want are some basic improvements in cognitive performance, improvements in your concentration, but you don't want to sleep so long that when you wake up, you get that sleep inertia, almost like a sleep hangover effect. 20 minutes is about the sweet spot to get some really good benefits and not necessarily suffer too much of that sleep inertia when you wake up. And I would say probably don't nap after 3 p.m., assuming a normal bedtime. And the reason there is napping in the late afternoon and evening, it's a little bit like snacking before your main meal. You just take the appetite edge off your sleep hunger that night. So, yes, naps can make you smarter, and hopefully there's a little bit of protocolized information on maybe how you may want to nap.
And I'll also add that it can make you more creative, which I think is something you want at work. And there are great studies showing that a nap can make people's brain think in a more associative manner, which helps you make new connections. And you can imagine how helpful it is when you're working on some difficult task.
Exactly. And it's sleep in some ways is, and naps have been demonstrated to do this just as a night of sleep does it. It's almost informational alchemy that you start to collide things together. You build these novel associations, and that's all about problem solving. And it's the reason I've always said that, no one has ever told me, at least in my life, Matt, you really need to stay awake on the problem. And they don't. And so there is definitely nap related benefits there too. Okay, next question.
So the next one's really interesting. Someone's asking, what's the wildest thing that can happen in your brain while you're in deep sleep?
A deep sleep. Okay. Maybe two for me. The first may be a little bit unimpressive when you hear it, but understand how radically impressive it is at the level of the brain, which is just the physiology of deep non-REM sleep. When we look at deep non-REM sleep, you get these huge, big, powerful, slow brain waves. They go up and down, maybe just once or twice a second. They're beautiful and they're big and they're powerful, but What you may not realize is what is having to happen to do that at the level of the brain. It's a time like no other across the 24-hour period, because at that moment when we go into deep non-REM sleep, for reasons that we're still really only starting to understand, hundreds of thousands of brain cells in your cortex, they all synchronize themselves and they all fire together, and then they all go silent together. And then they all fire together, and then they all go silent together. It's almost like a neural mantra chant that they sort of cry out and then they go silent, they cry out and they go silent. We never see that level of cooperative neural brain cell synchrony at any other moment during the 24-hour period. It is utterly wild when you think about what it must take to coordinate that. It's like when you see a football games or soccer for some people in the World Cup, and you get that soccer wave that goes around the stadium, all of a sudden you've got tens of thousands of people, and all of a sudden they all coordinate standing up and then sitting down, standing up and sitting down. That's part of deep brainwave sleep activity. I find that absolutely wild, according to the question. I think the other thing that's kind of nuts is the following. And this was really work that probably was pioneered by Bruce McNaughton and Matt Wilson. Matt Wilson now at MIT. And what they found is that they were looking at how rats will learn. And they were measuring the individual brain cell activity in rats as they were running around a maze and learning the maze. And sure enough, the rat, as it would run around the maze and learn, there was a very specific signature of brain cell firing that seemed to map out the maze that it was learning. And so if you were to think about placing a tone on each one of those brain cells, the rat is running around the maze and it's learning, and maybe the signature of learning would sound a little bit like bum 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 as the rat is sort of running around the maze. So they were measuring that whilst the rat was awake. But then something wild happened. They kept recording and they started listening in, almost eavesdropping on the memory centers of the brain as those rats fell asleep and when they went into deep non-REM sleep. What did they hear? They didn't just hear neural static. What they heard was the brain replaying the maze circuit, the maze learning signature. However, and this is what's especially wild about it, they weren't replaying it in real time speed. They were replaying it anywhere between 10 to 20 times faster. So if this was learning whilst the rat is awake running around the maze, when you listen in during deep non-REM sleep, what you heard was brum, 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 brum. Absolutely crazy. I mean, just the fact.
It's almost time travel.
It really is. It's as though the brain is almost compressing time. It's almost like a zip file from a time perspective. And what we think is happening here in part is that you're etching the memory into the circuit of the brain more powerfully. Think about sort of scoring a piece of glass, and you're just etching that memory circuit ever more deeply, ever more strongly. And that may in part explain why, after a bout of sleep, animals seem to learn and remember the maze better than before having a period of sleep. So to me, I think those are at least two of the wild and wacky, crazy things that happen during deep non-REM sleep. Etty, what have you got for us?
Well, the first one is that even though we're not really there, we're not aware, we're unconscious, there's always this part of our brain that keeps track of what's going on. And if there is someone's calling you, especially if they call out your name or there is a loud sound, you come back, you snap back into reality. And I think it's amazing that the brain can be so cut off on one level and doing all this maintenance and learning. But then there's always this part that keeps an eye open and helps us jump back. And, in a way, that's what differentiates death from sleep, right? Sleep is very reversible. The way the brain does that is amazing because from the outside, it looks like you're shutting down, but you're always there at a certain level.
And there's even more specificity than that. I remember there was a paper, I think it was published in the journal Neuron in 2003 or 4. This goes all the way back. And they had people sleeping inside of an MRI scanner, and they were playing specific words to them and phrases. And yes, it seemed as though the brain could produce some kind of a almost auditory processing response to meaningful phrases and words versus just kind of nonsense syllables, etc. In other words, it could seemingly discriminate between what was meaningful and not, even though the brain was asleep. But then what they did was a really clever part. They started to play salient sounds and words to the individual. So, for example, think of a new mother. They would play the cry of their specific baby relative to other cries. And what they found was that the brain had a particular novel processing response to a phrase or a sound from an individual that they knew and was very salient to them in their life. Now, these people weren't waking up, but the brain was still
Mm.
understanding not just real stuff versus not very real stuff. And furthermore, it could then discriminate between real stuff that was not salient versus real stuff that, my goodness, means a great deal to
Yeah.
me based on my history. That's the level at which you're talking about. That's
Amazing, isn't
wild
it?
too. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely wild.
it's very wild and it's so sophisticated.
God, what a great question. A partner for today's episode is AG1. What is AG1? AG1 is a nutritional drink and it contains a whole constellation of antioxidants, biotics, minerals, essential vitamins. It's a long list, but you get the the comprehensive picture, let's say. I've never been interested in fads or quick fixes with diets. It just doesn't work. And that's not what AG1 is about. I've been using AG1 for the past couple of years. I have been using it. And just to note, I do buy it myself. I'm not interested in the idea of freebies for the obvious trappings. But one of the reasons that I've been using it is because I did my research on the science behind the ingredients, and I do place a high priority on scientific data as ground truth. The new formulation that AG1 has, it has over, I think it's 50 revisions and improvements. That's how dedicated they are. And you can try AG1 and get a free 1 year supply of both vitamin D and K2. And for listeners of this podcast, you can also get, in addition to those things, 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. Head on over to drinkag1.com/Matt Walker. Again, that is drinkag1.com/Matt Walker. Okay, next up.
Next one. Oh, I love this one. And I actually personally want to hear your answer. Why do we sometimes wake up at 3 a.m. for no reason? And is there a hidden meaning behind it? For me, it's actually 5 a.m., but that's maybe because I go to sleep late. But yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
Very common.
so common. And I would say that when I'm out in the public giving talks, etc., when I do an audience Q&A, this is hands down the most common question. The first question I have back to the individual is, how do you know it's 3 a.m.? And right there is the first problem that you're facing. Do not clock watch. And Alison Harvey here at UC Berkeley has actually done this study. Having a clock face in your bedroom that you check makes your insomnia even worse. And there is no benefit to it. I know that there is such a strong temptation to think, oh goodness, what time is it? But knowing what time it is not going to help you. It's only going to make matters worse. There is actually a physiological reason in part why you get these essentially middle of the night awakenings for most people. And I'm just saying middle of the night because lots of people vary in when they go to bed and when they sleep. So on the clock face, it's not going to be the same time, but let's call it the middle of the night phenomenon. It's tied to our biology and our sleep architecture. What we know is that your core body temperature follows a natural cycle. and it rises throughout the evening, peaks around about 10:30 p.m. after having peaked in mid to late afternoon as well. And by the way, that peak in body temperature mid to late afternoon is the reason that when you look at when most Olympic world records are broken across the 24-hour clock face, there is this artificial spike right there in the late afternoon, early evening. Why? Because it is overlapping with when our core body temperature is highest, which is when our physical performance is at its best. That's another one of those things that just kind of blows my mind. But I'm drifting here, I'm drifting. And then after it peaks in the late afternoon, early evening, it starts to drop right around about, sort of assuming an average person, about 10:30 p.m. And that decline triggers melatonin release and it helps with sleep onset. However, as the body temperature drops in the first couple of hours of the night, that's where you're going to be fast asleep and you're not going to be waking up. But then your core body temperature starts to change direction and it starts to rise back up in the second half of the night. And again, assuming an average sleeper, that can start happening at around about the 3 a.m. mark. That's the first reason. The second reason that you're more likely to wake up then is not only because of a temperature change, but you've also at that point probably removed most of the healthy sleepiness that's been built up across the day, or what we call sleep pressure. And that's due to a chemical called adenosine, that the longer that we're awake, the more adenosine builds up, the more it builds up, the sleepier we feel. And then when we sleep at night, particularly in deep sleep, which is in the first kind of 2 or 3 hours of the night, the brain gets the chance to clear away that adenosine. So we don't have that heavy, nice sleepiness weighing us down by the time that we get to the middle of the night. And so I think those are perhaps some of the reasons that you will be more likely to wake up at that time, and also the reason that it will be harder to fall back asleep relative to when you fell asleep 3 or 4 hours ago, because you're just not as sleepy anymore. You've already jettisoned a lot of that sleepiness. The other issue, of course, is that when we wake up, our brain starts to typically go through that Rolodex of anxiety at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
And that sort of whirring wheel of all of the stress. At that point, you start to ruminate. And when you ruminate, you catastrophize. And at that point, you're kind of dead in the water for the next hour or two. And so I would add to the fact that everything seems twice as bad in the dark of night than it does in the light of day. So no wonder you wake up and it's that much harder to get back to sleep because you've started to develop all of that anxiety. The other thing is that when you start to look at the clock and you check the time, you are imprinting a new association in your brain, which is that I'm awake and it's 3 o'clock. And once you start continually checking the time that you're waking up, you're just reinforcing this new learned association that 3 a.m. is the time when I need to be awake, when I should be awake. And so your brain also then has a contribution to this process in terms of a learned, reinforced response that you need to try to unlearn. So, what, I guess, should you do about it? For me, I think the biggest issue here is your job at 3 a.m. in the morning is to get your mind off itself. So, what are the typical strategies that I would advocate for to help you fall back asleep? The first is relaxation and breathing techniques. Probably one of the most effective tools, and I think Etty, you've spoken about this in an AMA previously, are these sort of different box breathing patterns. So you can do the 4-7-8 breathing pattern, which involves inhaling for a count of 4, holding it for a count of 7, and then exhaling for a count of 8. What that does is two things. It starts to lower your heart rate and your respiration, which has to happen for you to get back to sleep. And it also, by way of thinking about counting your breath out, it's very hard to have parallel processing in your brain regarding all of the stresses and the worries that are going on there. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think there's emerging data from a number of studies, and my friend Andrew Huberman included, regarding this thing called non-sleep deep rest. If sleep remains elusive, lying still in the dark in a quiet environment with your eyes open without moving, that can provide some restorative benefits. And it sort of walks you through a process of relaxing the body and disengaging the mind. And that's one of those other things that typically, even though your job in some ways is to stay awake during that, because these techniques are getting your mind off itself, the next thing that you remember after having started a non sleep deep rest protocol is, drumroll, your alarm going off in the morning, because all of a sudden you've got your mind off itself. Another method I would say is guided meditation. Really powerful data demonstrating that that's very effective to help quiet the racing mind, ease tension, and get you back to sleep. You can also do a body scan, which is not dissimilar to some of these methods too, where let's say you just start at the top of your head, you close your eyes and you start to walk down and you start to feel, where is any tension in your body? Can you feel it in your neck? Just relax your neck. Is your forehead a little bit tight and frowning? Just relax your forehead. Go down now into sort of the top of the shoulders, working down the back, and just move yourself through your body. And
Mm.
again, it's a way to start to disengage the body from being tense and reinforcing anxiety. And it's also a method of, again, getting your mind off itself. The other thing I would say is take a mental walk. If all of this sounds a little bit kind of woo woo and crunchy, just think about a walk that you can remember in hyper detail. And again, this comes from Dr. Alison Harvey's work here at UC Berkeley. So, for example, if I'm struggling, I will do one of two things. Maybe I'll take the dog for a walk mentally. So I open the drawer, I get the leash out, which colored leash? I'll take the blue one this time. I close the door with my left hand. I clip the dog in with my right hand, open the front door with my left hand, take a left down the step. It's that level of detail that you have to go into. And again, all of these things have one thing in common. You're getting your mind off itself, because sleep at that time of night is a little bit like trying to remember someone's name. The harder that you try,
Yeah,
the further that you push it away. And as soon as you stop trying, all of a sudden, that's when sleep comes back to you. Because,
exactly.
you know, I don't know if you think like this, Etty, but for me, sleep is not something that we make happen. Sleep is
No,
something that happens to us,
we
and
don't
you have
summon
to
sleep.
create. Correct, exactly. Yeah, wouldn't that be lovely if we did? And
No,
in fact, that's perhaps the reason that there's been such a multi-billion-dollar industry in these things called sleeping pills, because that is the version of demanding sleep to yourself. And that's for another podcast episode. So I would say that's the underlying biological set of reasons that you wake up usually at that time, or that time of night is an especially fragile time of night. And then tips and suggestions for how to overcome that problematic issue. Also, I would say that when you wake up, don't go through to the kitchen, don't eat, don't check email. All of those things are going to further reinforce that new learned association that your brain needs to be waking up at 3 a.m. in the morning. You need to break that association. What are your ideas, thoughts around that?
the question was also, is there any hidden meaning behind it? And a lot of the time, there isn't. If we could predict if someone would wake up in the middle of the night, then we would all be millionaires. But we really don't know why sometimes sleep is broken like that. That there are several reasons, but sometimes it's really just completely spontaneous and it's completely natural as well. So you shouldn't think your sleep is broken because of that, because it is very common, right, man?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that I failed to mention there. That this notion of going to sleep when the lights go out, sleeping for 8 hours straight without any awakenings, either awakenings that you remember or that you don't, that almost never happens. That happens so rarely. And it's usually only happens when people are very, very sleep deprived and they're carrying a very
Yeah,
strong
when
sleep.
we're teenagers, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, when you're teenagers or even younger, when you're a kid. But no, normally it is a perfectly normal thing to wake up throughout the night and have some amount of awakening time during the night. I think it's only when it starts to become a repetitive phenomenon and a distressing phenomenon that
Mhm.
you need some of these tips and tricks. But no, your sleep is not broken. You are not broken. It's not as though your brain has forgotten the ability to sleep. and is no longer able to sleep. Don't think any of those things. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia and its powerful methods teach us that most all people can return to being good sleepers once they've become bad sleepers and once they've become an insomnia
Mhm.
patient.
And if it's any comfort from my individual experience with waking up in the middle of the night, sleep comes in cycles of about 90 minutes. And I've noticed that these wake periods will at most also last up to 90 minutes. So sometimes if I feel like it's just going to take an hour to fall back asleep, just relax and enjoy this time, and sleep will come when it's ready. So I think the worst thing you can do is really stress about when am I going to fall back asleep. So just know that at most it'll take a sleep cycle to go back and it'll come back, and just enjoy the time you have with yourself.
Yeah, I think that's another great point, and it's something that I've been trying to make more light of because from people like me back 4 or 5 years ago, when I started to speak more about sleep and become more of a public figure with sleep, I was probably far too dictatorial, and my TED talk, which should have been titled "Sleep or Else," got people, I think, very, very anxious and concerned, and I feel really bad about that. Which is to say, everyone is going to have a bad night of sleep. We all have it. And just because you have a bad night of sleep doesn't mean you're going to wake up and your brain is going to be filled with Alzheimer's proteins and you're going to be in hospital because of cardiovascular issues. And you go, no, don't listen to idiots like me who fear mongering like that. I'm so sorry. I would say, just to riff on what you said, one of my other suggestions is when you wake up, if you can't fall back asleep, just accept that tonight is not my night. It's just not my night. And that's okay. Tomorrow may be a bit of a rough day, but you know what? I'm just going to sit here and I'm just going to rest. I am not going to try and force sleep because I know I can't sleep right now. I'm just going to keep my eyes open and I'm just going to rest. And wouldn't it be amazing if in the middle of the day, someone came into your office and said, by the way, just come through, just have a lie down on the bed here. No need to fall asleep. You can just rest for the next hour. Just have a really good rest. Wouldn't that be lovely? Well, just take that mentality and apply it to sleep. Don't get stressed. You're just going to have a lovely period of rest. Eyes open, just rest. It's okay. And again, usually after about 30 or 40 seconds of keeping your eyes open, and usually when you stop stressing, you stop trying. Once again, it comes back. Today's podcast is brought to you by the wonderful folks at 23andMe. It's a service I've trusted for over 8 years. As a sleep scientist, I've been really interested in how 23andMe integrates sleep genetics with advanced health insights to help you proactively manage your well-being. With 23andMe Plus Total Health, you get advanced genetic screening, offering insights into whether you're more inclined to be a morning person or a night owl, how deeply you might sleep, and if you're predisposed to shallow or restless sleep, helping you tailor your sleep habits to your natural tendencies. Total Health also includes comprehensive blood tests to track your health throughout the year and a biological age feature showing how your body is aging internally. Plus, clinicians trained in genetics can help create a personalized preventative health plan, empowering you to make informed health decisions. Invest in your health today, including your sleep health, by visiting 23andme.com/Matt Walker for 10% off your membership. That's 23andme.com/Matt Walker. Okay, next question.
That's a great point, Matt. So the next question is kind of related to sleepiness. Is sleep debt a real thing, or are we doomed to be tired forever?
Doomed. No.
Doomed.
Yeah.
Let's do some fear
Uh,
mongering again.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Matt Walker, Dr. Sleep Doom slash Axl Rose. So the idea of a sleep debt, it is real that we know there is such a thing as sleep debt. And what it refers to is the accumulated sleep loss over time when you're not getting enough rest. And there is now a huge literature really that can confirm that missing your innate sleep amount, in other words, not getting enough sleep, the sleep that your brain and your body needs, it does have cumulative effects both for your brain cognitively and physical health. Now, the body can recover from short term sleep debt by paying back some of those lost hours. In the brain, it's a little bit more debatable. There's things like learning and memory tasks where if you don't sleep the first night after learning, you lose the chance to consolidate and strengthen those memories. Even if you get lots of recovery sleep on the second and the third night, it doesn't return that cognitive benefit that you would have obtained. I think there's also some fantastic work by people like David Dinges and another group led by Dr. Belenki and colleagues. And what they were doing was they were giving people different doses of sleep restriction. They either allowed them sort of 8 or 9 hours of time in bed, then 7 hours of time in bed, then 5 hours of time in bed, then 3 hours of time in bed. And they just kept enforcing that across about 1 week. And sure enough, there was a dose response that the greater the accumulated debt, both over time from one night to the next within any one of those conditions, and also in terms of the extent. So the group that was getting 3 hours a night, night after night after night, their cognitive impairment increased ballistically. Whereas those who were getting 7 hours of sleep versus nine, they still had cognitive impairment, but it just progressed at a much more gentle rate. That wasn't the interesting part. That clearly demonstrated that we have accumulated sleep debt as measured by the extent of impairment caused by the debt. The interesting part was that at the end of that study, they then gave them up to 3 nights of recovery sleep, and they were allowed to sleep as much as they wanted. Yes, their cognitive performance started to come back down to baseline, but even after 3 nights of recovery sleep, it still had not returned back to their fully sleep rested performance when they entered the study. So I think for me, it demonstrates that there is such a thing called sleep debt. You can overcome and pay back some of that sleep debt, where some of these functions will start to return back to baseline levels. But we currently actually don't really know too much about how much recovery sleep do you need before you finally wipe out the debt, if you can ever wipe out the debt entirely. And there's some work in the immune system demonstrating that you can't. The great studies by Jan Bourne looking at the immunization of individuals when they've accumulated a sleep debt and they don't produce a normal, healthy antibody response when they are underslept and carrying a sleep debt relative to individuals who had been getting a full night of sleep. And then they gave them lots of recovery sleep and tested them about a month later. And still, their antibody response had not spiked. They hadn't produced a proper antibody response, meaning that they hadn't benefited from the injection. And then they measured them up to a year later to see if they could see those circulating antibodies as if they had finally got a successful vaccination response. And even a year later, they didn't see that. There was still an impairment. So I think there is definitely hope here that you can clear some of the debt off the books of your sleep deficit. But there are some things, unfortunately, that once the debt has been imposed, that debt will always be essentially evident in certain impairments in both your brain and body function. In other words, if you don't snooze, you lose in the case of many of these things in terms of fairly soon afterwards. Any thoughts on? I know there's lots of other data that is there with sleep debt. We've covered before, Ken Wright's fantastic study on sort of social jet lag, and you always seem to remember that data far better than I do. But any other thoughts there?
What I find interesting about sleep debt is the objective versus subjective sense of it. So, in some of the studies you mentioned, people were asked after each day how tired they feel. And because their sleep was restricted, so immediately the first or the second day, they still feel pretty tired. But what you see that subjectively over a few days, they start feeling better with the same level of sleep. So even though we're seeing that the sleep debt is impairing their objective performance, subjectively they might say that they're feeling okay. So it's really interesting when you do these sleep restriction studies that there's a diverging kind of effect in terms of how people feel about it versus how people actually perform. So I think it might be misleading, and maybe it's the reason this question is asked, because you might feel like you're doing better or you're feeling less drowsy. But when we do test people's performance, we can see the sleep debt is still present there.
In other words, when you are sleep deprived, you don't know how sleep deprived you are. And I think to me, it's a little bit like a drunk driver at a bar. You know, they've had 6 or 7 beers, a couple of shots. They pick up their car keys and they say, "No, look, I think I'm fine to drive." And your response is, "No, I know that subjectively you think that you're doing fine. Trust me, objectively, you are not. Let me just grab your car keys and I'll call
Yeah.
you a taxi and we'll get you home." As you said, that's the inherent danger that we just assume, and especially over months or years when you're just not getting sufficient, maybe you're just sleeping 6 hours a night, night after night, year after year, the level of your cognitive performance, you also start to just acclimate to it. And you just think, well,
Yep.
this is me. This is how I am now as I'm progressing at this, whatever age you are. This is me at this age and my cognitive performance. And what you realize is that if you were to start for the next couple of months sleeping, let's say, giving yourself an 8 hour sleep opportunity rather than maybe a 6 hour opportunity, there is a better version of you sitting underneath that sleep debt. And if you can try to overcome that and not continue to accumulate it, it's a far better version of you than you had once imagined. Okay, maybe we can squeeze time in for one more quick question.
Right. So the next question, can we actually learn a new language or skill in our sleep, or is it just sci fi?
Yeah, it's a good question. It reminds me, someone sent me a cover of a magazine called, I think it's Mechanics Monthly. I don't know if the magazine is still going, but it's back in the
Did
60s.
you have trouble sleeping? Is that why they
And
sent it to you?
yeah, probably to get my mind off itself. And so on the front cover is this guy who's sleeping and he's got a tape recorder next to him and it's kind of, pumping out these words of French or something, as if he just turns on the tape recording. You're listening to French throughout the night. You wake up and hey presto, you are fluent and you are off and away to Paris. It's a phenomenon that's been termed hypnopedia, this concept of sleep learning, as it were, and it's got a long history to it. Unfortunately, we can dispense with this pretty quickly. The idea of acquiring new knowledge during sleep, I can see that it's really appealing. There is a kind of a diet version, a diluted version of this, but the evidence really does not favor this de novo passive ability to acquire complex information as we're sleeping and then waking up, almost like Neo in the Matrix, where he just says, "Okay, teach me how to fly a helicopter in the next three
I know
seconds."
Kung Fu.
Yeah. Do you imagine if that's what you said when you woke up in the morning to your partner? They just look at you and
And
they
then they
think,
run.
yeah. Or they just roll their eyes and they just think, "Oh, here
Yeah,
we
of
go
course.
again." Yeah, exactly. I've never wanted you more. But I would say that the notion of foreign language learning solely through passive exposure during sleep, it lacks any substantive evidence. And in fact, people have tried it. And if anything, the evidence is robust in its falsification of that hypothesis. It's not to say, however, that your brain can't learn some basic new associations. And there's lots of people who have demonstrated this, that you can learn a new association between a specific sound and a specific word during sleep. And those findings, I think, suggest that while the brain can still process auditory stimuli during sleep, just as we've described, and it can kind of bond that together with some novel little piece of information like a new word, and you can retrieve it better the next day than if you had not had those purrings being played to you at night. The idea that you could learn, something as complex as a language, unfortunately, it's just not true. I would say you're much better off focusing on learning during the day and then sleeping on that information at night to get the best results. That's probably the better prescription for language learning in my mind. There is actually a really fascinating twist on this kind of learning of two basic pieces of information and bonding them together, learning little new factoids. that has been used. It's a clever twist and a clever mechanism, and it's called targeted memory reactivation. Etty, I know that you know more about this than me, and we wrote about it in a recent review of ours in a journal looking at the latest and greatest in sleep science. Tell folks about targeted memory reactivation is, or TMR.
Yeah, it's a really cool technique. So instead of trying to feed the brain evidence while it's asleep, what you do is you try to teach individuals information before they sleep. So, for instance, we pair a word to a specific sound, and then people go to sleep, and those sounds are played while they're in non REM sleep. What the evidence shows is that hearing these sounds, so again, the brain can process some information during sleep, kind of tells the brain to work on this memory. It reminds the brain that, okay, this sound is related to that word. And it helps boost the learning that typically happens during non REM sleep. So then in the morning, people who were cued by these sounds have better memories of the word sound pairs than people who just slept. They all have better memories relative to someone who wouldn't sleep, but those that were cued have an even better advantage at learning. So, in some way, if there is something you want to learn and you have this information in your brain before you go to sleep, and you can somehow remind the brain during sleep to work on these memories, then you're basically learning during sleep. You're boosting something that the brain is already doing during sleep. So, I think it's similar to what you'd want to achieve.
Yeah, it's almost as though you're giving the brain VIP access to specific memories. It's kind of like a nod, nod, wink, wink. By the way, sleep, can you just come over here?
Exactly.
And,
A
I'm
little
just,
nudge.
yeah, I'm just going to cue you and point you to the things that I would really like you to be learning rather than maybe the things that you had pre-programmed to be working on. I want to give priority red carpet access to these things instead. So I think it's a very clever technique. I always thought, though, that the method itself, it was never born of this intent. It was born of a looking at the sleeping brain and understanding it experimentally. But in some ways, there's a very big dose of hubris in this, which is to say that it took Mother Nature, whatever it was, 3.6 million years to put this thing called the necessity of sleep and 7 to 9 hours in place for us human beings, and all of the functions that it has gradually learned over those millions of years to perfect. And then we come along, and all of a sudden, within the space of 10 years developing a technique, we think that we have a better
Mhm.
blueprint prescription at night for what the brain should be working on in terms of salient information to help improve us as an organism, as an individual entity. So we hijack the process. We think, no, 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 no. I know you've got those millions of years of wisdom, but trust me, I know better, and I'm just going to override the system. I always thought, gosh, there is a little bit of hubris in there, isn't there?
It's a bit
Anyway,
like lucid dreaming, isn't it?
yeah, you're just overriding a system and saying, no, I know that you think you know what I should be dreaming. Yeah, not so much. I've got it from here. I'll take the reins.
I'll take
Thanks.
it from
Take
here.
care. Yeah, goodbye. Okay, with all of that, let us wrap this one up. Etty, thank you so much. Elegant, insightful as always. Where, remind people, can they find you and your brilliant mind out there in the webosphere?
Webosphere. I would love to hear from you guys. My email is etoosh, etoosh, at gmail.com. And etoosh is also my handle on Twitter or X. Please feel free to write.
Wonderful. Folks, until next time, please keep your questions coming, even if they are about me clearly wishing to be a 1980s frontman for a rock band. Please,
90s, no?
1990s. Yes, what am I?
You've been
Uh,
upgraded, man. Come
yeah,
on.
exactly. Oh my goodness, Matthew. What a way to end the episode. A 10-year memory lapse. Wonderful. Who's getting sleep and who has a sleep debt here between the
Yeah.
two of us? Keep the questions coming on social media. Send them to myself or send them to Etty. We would love to hear from you. These are great questions. For now, take care, folks. Sleep well, and we will see you in the next one. Bye for now.